Hello Year 12, welcome back to another video for your prescribed text for Module A. This is another one of the poems that you will be required to study for our module. So today we're going to be looking at Vuong Pham's Mother. So as normal, can you please make sure you have a copy of the poem in front of you to be making annotations on, as well as something else you can also make notes on. We will be looking briefly at the composer's context, as well as a little bit of historical context surrounding some of the events that are referenced in the actual poem itself. So you've got a bit of that background knowledge going into it. If you have not read the poem yet, please do so now, so that you can obviously fully interpret everything that's going on before we start annotating. Because it is quite a long poem, I have changed up the way that I've annotated it slightly in this video, hopefully to cut down a little bit of time, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so we're going to start off with the composer's context. So Vuong Pham himself is a school teacher. He teaches English and SOSC, which is essentially like social studies, almost like HISI, I guess, in terms of what we would know it as. So he lives in Brisbane, where he was born to parents who came to Australia from Vietnam as refugees. So he'd be considered a second generation Australian. So Pham received the Edwards Property Mentorship Award through the Ipswich Poetry Fest, I think I spelled that wrong, competition in 2011. So obviously he's quite talented in terms of poetry, which is why we are studying him. His poetry has appeared in anthologies as well as journals and magazines in Australia and overseas. So obviously quite a prolific and, well awarded writer. Okay, so now we know a little bit about the actual poet himself. I just wanted to briefly touch on the historical context. So it won't be as in-depth as that first video that we did look at, but it is important that you know a little bit about the events that were unfolding across the globe in the 1970s. I'm sure you probably did study this in junior history as well, but this is a very, very brief summary, enough to kind of, I guess, catch you up to speed so you understand some of the events that are being discussed and alluded to in the poem. So the American War, also known as the Vietnamese War or the Vietnam War, ended in 1975. So Australia was heavily involved in that war alongside, obviously, America. But it did end in 1975. This resulted in many Vietnamese refugees being settled in Australia. So a lot of Vietnamese-born people fled Vietnam at that time because of the events of the war, and a lot of them were settled in Australia. So at this time, Australians, like the Australian public, were very divided about their involvement in the war. So this is one of the first times that a lot of people were kind of turning on the Australian government and its involvement in the war. And a lot of people say this is due to the fact that this is one of the very first wars that was really publicized and televised in a way that really we hadn't seen before, because the television had been out for a couple of decades at that point, but it wasn't something that was readily available in the home until around this time, and it wasn't as popular. So say back in World War One and World War Two, a lot of the information that was spread was maybe through things like newspapers. This time you're seeing like real events. You're actually seeing people being killed and people being hurt from our involvement in the war. So there was a lot of people that were against the war, and it was, as I said, one of the first times that this was kind of happening. That people were disagreeing with the government's involvement. And this led, as I've said here, to a lot of Australians being divided. So a lot of people were for it, and a lot of people were against it. And as a result of this, it varied the public's opinion on whether or not Vietnamese asylum seekers should be allowed to settle in Australia. So those people that were fleeing their country because they didn't want to obviously die or be affected or be a part of what was happening in the war, a lot of people were saying, yes, absolutely, they should come to Australia because, it's our fault that they are fleeing in the first place. We are the ones who are involved in this war and have forced them to do this. But then you got the other side who are also saying, you know what, no, we don't need any more people, we're full, we don't need these people coming over here, which is very ironic because this is literally still happening today. It's just a different country that we're referring to, or a different group of people. So prior to 1975, fewer than 2,000 Vietnamese-born people lived in Australia. This is from a census information that I can see, although there were some discrepancies because some weren't always counted, but that's still around. It's a very low figure. So in comparison to the 2011 census, obviously it would be a little bit more now from our most recent census, but 185,000 people in Australia were born in Vietnam. So there's obviously been a huge influx of Vietnamese migration in Australia. I do have a little video here from 1979. So this was obviously a couple of years after the war had ended, but around from 1975 into the 80s is when there was a really big influx of Vietnamese migrants. So obviously there was that first influx of people fleeing as asylum seekers, and then there was another push for more Vietnamese individuals to come because they had family members and whatnot. They wanted to come over and settle in Australia. And at this time there was, as I said, a divide within the public as to who should be allowed to come and settle in Australia, which, as I said before, is very ironic because it's still conversations that we're having today, 50 years later. So, 40 years later, sorry. So I would like you to just watch this, just to give you a bit of a sense about the public opinion at the time, and maybe even think about, is this still maybe opinions that you still hear today from people? And we might have a discussion about this in class as well, obviously once we're all together.
I think they should come to Australia, yes. I think they deserve a place in the world the same as everybody else.
I think we have to.
Have to what?
Take them in. I just don't think we've just got such a big country and lots of space. I think we just have to be kind in terms of the rest of the world, that's all.
I think there are so many problems here on the home front that need to be solved first of all before we start taking an extra influx of people from overseas.
Do you not think we have some responsibility to these people?
No, we have more responsibility to people in this country.
Many of these people quite possibly will die or will starve as a result of not being able to find a place to go to. Right. Doesn't that fact at least temper your thinking?
No, because that situation's occurring in other parts of the world, and we can't solve all the world's problems in that area at the moment. So, as I say, I think the main priority is here on the home front.
I don't think we should at this stage.
Why
We've got enough troubles of our own.
But these people have many more troubles than we have, and they need somewhere to go.
That's right, yes, their standards are lower too.
Meaning?
Oh, I think that we've got to look after our own first at the moment.
I think we have a responsibility to do something for them as soon as we were involved in the war. We can't turn our back on the responsibility when we were previously involved.
I think we all have to think in terms of the one world, one humanity. And we all have international obligations to fulfill if it's going to be a peaceful world for everybody.
Do you think we should take as many as we can fit in?
Yes, I do, most definitely.
Do you think
and I think that we should cooperate in many ways to make sure that the needs of these people are fulfilled.
What about the racial tension that might well be created here as a result of
Well, I think that we have to implement new education schemes into the schools to change people's attitudes and their prejudice.
Well, we fought in Vietnam, so I think it's fair enough that we should have some sort of responsibility towards the people.
What if it came to taking these people in the tens of thousands that they exist in now?
Well, don't you think it should be split up with the rest of the world, though?
Well, they've got to have some place to stay, and if Australia has an economy that can support that kind of activity, I don't see anything wrong with it. If it's going to be a burden on the economy, and you really don't have the facility to support them, I don't think it's a good deal.
A lot of Australians are saying we should look after ourselves first.
I disagree with that. That's an isolationist philosophy.
I guess it depends on whether you want an Australian country as it is now or a totally different country. My own feeling is that I rather like it the way it is.
I think we should take a lot of refugees.
Why do you feel that way?
Well, I just feel it's an obligation to our fellow man.
How do you think Australians would react as a whole?
I don't think terribly well, because basically, unfortunately, we are racist, whether we like it or not.
Because we're an Asian country and we've got to recognise the fact.
Do you think it would cause racial hostility in this country, though?
In this country, certainly. But the sooner we get that out of our systems, the better. We'll wake up to where we are and what we're doing.
No, I don't think we're obliged to take many of them at all. Not in the numbers that they're professing to want to take into the country. Another 10,000 before Christmas or something, isn't it?
If they died, if these people, men, women and children, died, rather than come to Australia, what would your choice be then? if that was the option? Australia or
there
death
must be
for
other
these people?
alternatives rather than flood our economy with them. Who's paying for them? We're paying for them. We're going to hand out through taxes and so forth. We're already taxed the hilt on it. How are we going to afford them? We can't. Who's going to employ them? I don't agree with it at all.
Thanks.
Totally against it. We've got too many on the place, on the dole now, put it that way.
Okay, so obviously, as we can see by that video, even though it was 40 years ago, there was still a massive divide within the public opinion on refugees. Obviously, at this time, it was mainly Vietnamese refugees coming to Australia. So as I said, we might discuss that a little bit further in class, because I would love to hear your opinions and your ideas about even your thoughts. Like, what do you think about this idea? Because I know some of you have relatives who have come here and become refugees. So it'd be fantastic to hear your opinions on this particular debate. Okay, so as I said, I've kind of changed up the way that I've annotated the poem here. So I won't be able to actually add in arrows and highlight certain things, but I obviously can still use my mouse and whatnot. But I've got all the annotations ready to go, and I'm just going to kind of go through them and hopefully to save a little bit of time. So obviously, if I'm going a little bit too fast for you, you can pause the video. That's kind of the point of these videos. But we'll start with obviously the first couple of stanzas to begin with. So as I said, if you have not read this poem in its entirety, please do so now. It is the longest poem of the collection that we're looking at, but I honestly really love this poem. I think it's really beautiful, and it's one of my favorites from what we're looking at, if not my favorite. Okay, so obviously the title of the poem itself, it's pretty self-explanatory. Mother, this is obviously someone who gives birth, someone who is a nurturer by... That's their role, is to raise something or raise someone. And that whole idea will be very, very clear throughout this entire piece. So we notice at the very first line there, it says, "I know now as I did in my childhood wonder that my mother dreamed of a paradise, one unbound by war and exodus." So to start off, much like the last two poems we've looked at, we've got our personal pronouns automatically. So we've got right here, "I know now as I did in my childhood wonder." We know that this person is speaking reflectively. We know that this person, whoever the speaker is, we're going to assume it's Vuong Pham, but we could just refer to them as a speaker. We know that this person is referring to them and their experiences. So it's reflective on time. The speaker is positioned as the son who reflects on his childhood. His mother dreamed of peace and a life without war. So we can kind of interpret from this very first line that this is the son talking about his own mother. Okay. Okay, so we've got a historical allusion coming up here, which is why I kind of gave you that little historical context just then. So we've got here one unbound by war and exodus. This is obviously a reference to the Vietnam-American War. We know that Vuong Pham's parents came from Vietnam, and he was born in Brisbane. So we're going to make an assumption here that this is a reference directly to the Vietnamese War and that influx of Vietnamese refugees that came to Australia during the mid-70s all the way through to the 80s. Okay, we've got inclusive language coming up here in our second stanza. So, "On the living room carpet we sit, I pluck her grey hairs and ask, 'Mother, whatever was your passion in life?' She smiles. That eternal smile, a question suspended in mid-air. Her neck tilts like a sunflower, too heavy to meet the sky." So we've got that inclusive language coming through. The term here in this line here, we. You know, the we represents a connection between the speaker and his mother. So it's no longer just about him and using the word I. He's now referencing that there's more than one person that he's referring to. It's him and his mum. So that is obviously symbolic of some sort of connection between the speaker and his mum. So we've got here in the second line, "I pluck her grey hairs and ask." This can be interpreted as some sort of symbolism, this grey hair, the grey hairs themselves. If you think about a grey hair and why people have grey hairs, there's a lot of different reasons, but we can interpret it as it may symbolize, you know, the passing of time or old age. Generally, people who are older will have grey hairs. Not always, but That's generally why it would happen. Stress, we know that stress can scientifically, biologically create grey hairs. And this might represent or symbolize obstacles. And obviously when he's referring to his mum, he is referring to the fact that she's obviously older now. This is some sort of stress. She may have been through some sort of stress or some sort of obstacles in her life. And these may be represented in his description of her grey hairs. So the son is plucking these, like pulling them out, plucking these, and is taking the nurturing role the mother once had. So it's almost like the roles have reversed slightly. Normally you would think that the mother is the one kind of taking care and grooming the son. It's now flipped. Now that she's a little bit older, he's the one kind of sitting down there and helping her because she's been through a lot. So again, we're seeing this very, very strong relationship between the mother and the son. We've got a bit of dialogue coming through in our third line of that second stanza, where he says, "Mother, whatever was your passion in life?" He poses that question to her. It's almost like it's a reflective conversation between the son and the mother, and it sets up a time shift for later on. So he's asking her a question. We know that the time shift is going to kind of happen a little bit later on because she's obviously, hopefully, going to answer this question. We see our use of caesura here. I'm not sure if I've actually spoken to you guys about caesura. I think I may have in our last video, but just in case I haven't, it's a deliberate break within the line. So if you think about the best way that I remember it anyway is Caesar, Julius Caesar. He was kind of, I don't know why I think of this. I could be wrong here, but he gets stabbed, obviously, when he dies. So it's like that. This is a very weird explanation, but he gets that. There's some sort of break there. There's a line. There's a definite. And if you think about it as well, like cesarean, there's like a line cut in someone. I don't know. This is just the way that I remember it. Hopefully, it'll help you remember it too. But there's a line that's cut in a person when they, there's a C-section, a cesarean, caesura. That's the way I remember it. I'm weird. Okay, leave me alone. That's fine. But there's that deliberate break. It's essentially what it means. There's a break in the line, and it's meant to create a pause of some sort. Okay, so in this particular case, the poet has used that break in the line, that caesura, as it's a time of reflection. She's answering. She's thinking about answering the question. She smiles, and this break represents her thinking and her reflecting. It forces us to stop and think too. Maybe it makes us think about what's our passion in life, or what is the mum's passion in life. Do we ever actually speak to our parents or our mum and say, "What was your passion in life?" Or what is your who knows? So, but the actual function of that particular technique is to force us to pause. So it actually puts us in her shoes a little bit too, because she's pausing to think about it. And then we've got a little bit of natural imagery through this simile that's coming through here, where she says, she's described as her neck tilts like a sunflower, too heavy to meet the sky. So the mother's being compared to a sunflower here. So while she tilts her head to reflect, so often when you're thinking of an answer, you kind of tilt your head a little bit like, that's kind of what's being created here, that image. It also shows how much responsibility possibly she's had in her life. Usually that idea that, you've got that burden, there's so much there that you can barely hold yourself up. Possibly it's so heavy. This heaviness is actually a lot of the stuff that she's had to endure in her life. And it's hard to bear. I hope I've used the right bear there. I think I have. You've got that natural imagery, which may also refer to her nurturing role as a mother too. So she's being compared to a sunflower, which is quite a natural thing. And same for her as well. Her role as a mother is quite natural. I will keep coming back to this idea of the nurturer and the idea of the mother, because it's completely, this poem is riddled with that idea. Okay, but we'll move on to our next stanza. Gardening is the reply I expect. My mind's eye turns to childhood, to shadows stirring beneath starfruit trees, rows of cherry tomatoes growing over fences, a call to supper while sleeping amongst lotus-dotted ponds. So again, we've got this natural / nurture imagery kind of coming through as we move into this description of this garden. If you think about a garden, it's full of life. It's full of things being nurtured in order to grow and to flourish and to blossom, the same way that she would, as a mother, be helping her children grow and flourish and blossom. So a little bit of context here. Starfruit, or carambola, is a species of trees which are tropical to Southeast Asia, which would be Vietnam as well. So this is a clear connection to his culture and his mother's homeland of Vietnam. This sibilance is being used as well here. So if you don't remember, sibilance is that repetition of that S sound. It's coming through. So you've obviously got right here the shadows stirring beneath starfruit trees. That even kind of coming through to here, which is not quite as prominent, the sibilance, but fences call to supper while sleeping amongst lotus-dotted ponds. So there's that repeated kind of sound. The way that I'm interpreting this is possibly recreating the sound of leaves scraping, or even the rustling in the wind of the leaves. You know, if you ever stand outside on a windy day near a tree, you hear that kind of noise kind of coming from the leaves. Possibly that could be why, because this is a very descriptive stanza. It's meant to paint this picture in our head of this particular garden that we're kind of envisioning. And so the poet is also using that auditory image, auditory language of sibilance to make us hear our environment as well. So the speaker's reflecting once again on his childhood. There's this time change. So he's gone back and he's thinking about this mind's eye, he's saying there. That's that kind of part of your brain where you kind of visualize something. Our mind's eye, his turns to childhood. So this is what he's seeing in his childhood. We've gone back in time in his mind now. He's reflecting on what he sees. He sees this beautiful garden. The garden is personified right here where it says the shadows stirring. This natural landscape is being given human characteristics. It is giving life to this homeland. It is more than a place to her. It is a living being. So it's more than just a physical place. It's full of life. It's like a person to her. This homeland, this culture is so important to her and him. Lotus flower, lotus dotted ponds. It's interestingly the national flower of Vietnam. So again, we've got that connection to the mother's homeland through this imagery being created. And I've just done a little bit of research as well about possibly what the flower itself represents. So it does symbolize purity, beauty, fertility, which is quite important when we're talking about the idea of the mother, and knowledge. So all of these things, I think that the son could definitely be ascribing, or could describe his mother as. And from what I'm getting here, now we know a little bit about the background context of the poet himself, and the fact that he didn't grow up in Vietnam the way that the mum did. He obviously grew up in Brisbane, or in Australia, and this garden is most likely the mum's garden that she's cultivated in her new homeland in Australia. She's got connections to Vietnam, which are shown throughout the plants that he's describing, so the starfruit and the lotus flower. Yeah, it's really interesting, these cherry tomatoes, which I did look up as well. They're not native to the same area that we're talking about, Southeast Asia. They're not native there, but they are very popular in European areas. So it's almost as if that these cherry tomatoes possibly represent this Anglo-Saxon culture. As it blossoms and flourishes, it might be a connection between the two. So this melding between this Vietnamese culture and this Australian culture are being represented through this garden that she's created. And also it could even represent possibly the sun, the fact that she has grown these plants in her garden, and it's a mixture of both Vietnamese plants and these European, I suppose, plants, or Australian almost plants, the same way that the sun is that. He's this mixture between the two. It might be even interesting, we could even go even further if we wanted to, the fact that these cherry tomatoes are growing over the fences. So possibly it's taking over, or there's a lot of it. Who knows? That's my interpretation of it anyway. Okay, we'll move on to the next stanza. All right, so teaching was my passion, she says. High school. I smile in agreement, and as I do, jigsaw puzzle pieces of memory lock together, my past made whole. A literacy teacher, I exclaim. She smiles, remembering with excitement the moment I arrived home from school with a certificate of improved literacy. I thought there's an interesting connection there to the poet, as he is now a teacher himself. So the mum, her hopes and dreams were to be a teacher. We're going to learn a little bit about that a bit later on in the poem. But it's now interesting to see that the actual son himself, Vuong Pham, is actually an English teacher now. And yeah. We've got a bit of enjambments or enjambment. These run-on lines coming through in the latter half of that second line. So we've got these run-on lines that are used to speed up the flow of the description. So it's forcing us to speed up. And as I do jigsaw puzzle pieces of memory locked together, my past made whole. It almost replicates the speed of these memories, which are kind of rapidly flooding back to him. When she says that she wants to be a teacher, he remembers immediately, a literacy teacher. So it's almost like that flow, or that speed of that line, the rhythm of that line is matching the flow and the speed of which these memories are coming back to him. This might be quite helpful for you in terms of your assessment task. But when she smiles and she's excited that he's come home with this certificate of improved literacy, almost challenges his assumptions of refugees or children of refugees, but they may not have strong literacy skills or may not speak English language very well. But he's actually, he challenges that idea because he does have strong literacy skills and English language skills, and we know that because he's now an English teacher. Pham is now an English teacher. He has followed in his mother's footsteps. So this is something she always wanted to do. And even the mother herself challenges those expectations, because unfortunately, a lot of assumptions are that refugees come to Australia and they can't speak the language properly. Whereas she clearly can, because we'll see later on what she did for a living back in Vietnam. All right, we will continue with our next stanza. So I continue to pluck her grey hairs. Our conversation lingers on as the soft daylight illuminates us. I know now, as I did in my childhood wonder, about my mother's youth before the bloodshed in Saigon. So we've got this natural and peaceful imagery coming through again. We've got a peaceful tone which has been created in the first 3 lines, as the poet deliberately uses the words such as soft to describe the illuminating daylight. So if you think about the first 3 lines there, it's quite a nice description. The conversation lingers on as the soft daylight illuminates us. It's very peaceful. It's very nice. This grey hair symbolism that we were talking about before, we can now refer to it as a motif because it's a reoccurring symbol that keeps coming back up. It keeps recurring. So the grey hair continues to serve as a representation of this hard work, the sacrifices, and possibly even the aging mother's Vietnamese culture that the son desperately wants to embrace. So there's lots of different meanings that could be behind this grey hair, but because it keeps popping up and keeps recurring, we're referring to it now as a motif. Just a little background context so you know what Saigon is or where it is. It was the capital of South Vietnam before the country was unified after the war. So there was a lot of death and destruction which occurred in this particular city. And now more commonly it's referred to as Ho Chi Minh City. So that will come in handy a little bit later. This is repetition coming through again where it's saying, I know now as I did my childhood wonder. He keeps repeating that. It's repeated once again to signify another time change. So every time he mentions that line, every time he repeats that through repetition, it's almost as if there's another event about to be reflected on. Time is changing once again. It's definitely his reflection on his own thoughts. And I thought it was really interesting as well that those first 3 lines we talked about how this tone of peace and this tranquility is kind of being created through the first 3 lines, and it's immediately juxtaposed as we move into the last half of that final line. So this description is immediately contrasted to the final line of the stanza as we are reminded of the devastating effects of the Vietnam War. So you've got that idea of peace immediately juxtaposed to that idea of war right alongside each other. Okay, our next stanza. I picture her driving a yellow scooter on the road to school, the freedom of her hair, a glimmering smile, spiriting past street markets, the soothing aromas of pho and lychee tea, that familiar crescendo of rickshaws, bicycles and scooters, landscapes of water buffalo, ploughing the flooded paddies from cloud to cloud, each one picturesque from her classroom window, and all of which was the city she will no longer call home. So, this particular stanza is jam-packed full of visual imagery here. So we're going back in time again. It's almost like he's reflecting on what he imagines her life would be like, what he's maybe been told about Vietnam, because obviously this isn't something that he's seen. This is something that he's imagining. He's picturing her driving as a younger woman. So he creates a joyful, free, and jubilant atmosphere through the use of color symbolism and word choice. Think about the word, the color yellow. Quite a happy, fun, vibrant color. This is the image that he's creating immediately in this very first line. There's this olfactory imagery being used. If you're not familiar, can't remember, olfactory is referring to the smell or the scent being created. It's used to envelop the reader's imagination and transport them to this town, the smells of the city. So you're referring to things like the street markets, the soothing aromas of pho, lychee tea. I haven't put this in here, but I just remembered here as well. It's really interesting that he's start talking about the freedom of her hair, a glimmering smile. Again, this hair imagery keeps coming back up. We're referring back to her grey hairs before. There's no reference here of grey hairs. He's actually describing her hair as free, which is almost some sort of personification. It's almost like she hasn't gone through these hardships. She hasn't gone through these struggles and this stress to make them grey yet. She's free. She's happy. And this is all kind of working together to create this picture in our mind. Got auditory imagery coming through, so that's obviously the use of sound. It again is transporting us to as the reader, to the environment. So we're hearing the crescendo of rickshaws, bicycles and scooters. If anyone has visited an overseas country, especially somewhere in Asia, a lot of places have lots of vehicles in one street, and the sound is almost deafening. But if you have been, you probably are familiar with what this kind of sounds like. You've got imagery is also used to clearly paint a picture in the reader's mind about the mother's culture. So you've got these ideas of water buffalo, ploughing the flooded paddies, these rice paddies, from cloud to clouds, these beautiful skies, each one picturesque from her classroom windows. So it's a very light-hearted, romanticized description of her homeland. It almost, to me, reads like it's something that he has been told about as a young boy in this beautiful, amazing place that his mum would have just, loved. And as I said, it's romanticized. Everything's perfect. It sounds almost euphoric in a way. However, again, right at the end, there's this abrupt tone change. The same as there was back here, right at the end, that bloodshed in Saigon. We've got that tone change coming through in that last line. It changes to one of sorrow and pity as she can no longer call it home. It's this beautiful, amazing place that she's happy and everything is perfect. She can't call it home anymore. It's symbolic of her crushed dreams and her and hopes. Okay. Okay. So we'll move on to the next stanza. Pause it, feel free. I'm probably going too fast for you as you're writing. Apologies, but, technology. You can pause. Okay, this is a really big one. Obviously, I didn't... I forgot to press that one, but that's fine. This is a very, very long stanza, and this is all one stanza. So I'll read it out. So more grey hairs fall. The past realigns itself, and I know now, as I did in my childhood wonder, that the teaching legacy passed down to me. I knew the responsibilities of providing for her children outweighed university degrees teaching aspirations. That in mind, I tell her, Mother, this week I taught my students Wordsworth, saw thousands of daffodils and thought of you. She smiles, and I'm taken back to a halcyon time in childhood. That reminds me how she stitched floral pajamas, tablecloths, bed sheets together using a sewing machine for less than $5 an hour to afford rice, pork, Asian vegetables, and help pay for my tuition so I could learn to spell persistent correctly. Praying that I might speak an unbroken English tongue and never be confined to the labours of factories. So we're going to get into that illusion in just a moment, but I want to start over here first. So the reader's taken back to the present day as the son and mother continue to reminisce. So you can imagine we're taken back to present day here. The mum and the son are still maybe sitting down, and he's still, picking out or plucking the grey hairs from her head, almost again symbolically taking away the stresses, taking away these obstacles that she's had to face. The grey hair, again, is a motif. It's used as I said, it's symbolic of the hardships of the past. Even the wisdom that she may be imparting on her son. She's teaching him as the mother. Even though that she, was a teacher, literally, she's taken on a new role as a teacher instead. She's teaching her son. So the son is reflecting on the sacrifices his mother had to make to help her children. So we're seeing that she no longer could, go to university and those aspirations of becoming a teacher. That's no longer something she could do because she has children now, and those responsibilities are where she put her priorities. So she had to give up these dreams for her children, which again you can maybe even link back to those grey hairs which she's referring to. So Wordsworth here, mother. This week I taught my students Wordsworth. Just a bit of background context. He was a prolific romanticist poet, and he actually this allusion here. It's almost, well, it is definitely alluding to one of his most famous poems. Sorry, which is called "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." I'll put a link to it below if you would like to read it. There's an interesting use of natural imagery being created here again. That should say mother. Sorry, the mother has nurtured her children the same way one would nurture flowers to blossom. So it kind of goes back to that imagery that was created in the garden. Same way that she's nurturing her kids and she's helping them grow and whatnot. She's doing that with the plants that she's creating. And it's interesting that he has included William Wordsworth's poem here, which is again another connection to that natural imagery. So again, he's listing here these sacrifices of motherhood that she had to make. It wasn't an easy road, clearly, that she had to stitch floral pajamas. She had to make the clothes for them. She had to make tablecloths, bed sheets. She used a sewing machine for less than $5 an hour. So she worked tirelessly just in order to afford, basic food for them and even help pay for his tuition. So she wanted him to do the best he could do. Halcyon as well, just to give you a bit of an understanding, the definition itself is peaceful, tranquil, calm. So for the son, it wasn't a traumatic time, even though for her, she's gone through all these hardships and she's doing so much, and her dreams are shattered, and she's doing everything she can to support her children. The children are calm. The children are peaceful. The children have a really blessed childhood because of the sacrifices she made. We've got a use of caesura here coming through right after this line fourth from the bottom. So I could learn to spell persistent correctly. So it's used for an effect. As I said before, the caesura is there. It's a deliberate pause. It's forcing us to pause as well as the actual speaker. And it's kind of it's almost, I think, making us reflect on the term of the word persistent. So he's deliberately used that word. He could have used any word he wanted to, but he's used that word. So I think it's interesting and deliberate use of that word because it's something that she had to be in order for her children to succeed, in order for her children to flourish, just like her garden. She had to be persistent. She had to give up her dreams of being a teacher in order to be a mother. And I think that's really beautiful. And this as well, I think you could reference back to these assumptions that you may talk about in your assessment task. But maybe these assumptions that people had about migrants in Australia, that they would, and you even saw it in the video that we watched before, that they'd be on the dole or whatever that older man was saying at the end, or they would come and who would pay for them? And clearly, this mother has, she's worked her way to afford these things. She's made things such as, the clothes or the tablecloths, the bed sheets. She's not, taking handouts or whatever you want to call them. She's challenging those assumptions of what it means to be a refugee because she's a hard worker. And she wants her son to succeed. She wants him to speak an unbroken English tongue because she knows that in this society, unfortunately, there is that prejudice against people who can't speak English fluently. And she doesn't want that for her son. She doesn't want him to be confined to these factories. Her new dream is for her children to succeed. Okay? All right. We'll move on to the next stanza. I know now, as I did in my childhood wonder, what it must have been to mother. What it must have been to mother. Oh, sorry. There among the refugee boats thrum, the faces of Saigon watching, eyeballs ribboned with flames, incandescent, a disorder of diaspora, animate in the missile storm. So again, we've got that repetition coming through. I know now, as I did in my childhood wonder, and you should know by now that this is another time signifier. We're going back in the past because we're reflecting once more on what has happened, on maybe this conversation that he's had with his mum. And there's this allusion again back to the Vietnamese War, the American War, the mother fleeing war-torn Saigon. So we've got the people of Saigon watched as their city quite literally is ravaged by flames. So when it's saying the faces of Saigon watching, these are the people that are on this boat watching their city burn and be destroyed by war. These eyeballs ribboned with flames is the reflection of this fire and catastrophe and destruction that they're literally viewing. They're watching their city burn, which would be a horrible feeling. You've got auditory language. It's evident once more. It's almost onomatopoeic in the way that it describes the sound of the small motor engine of the boat, that thrum. The refugees' boats thrum. Okay. Diaspora. Just to give you a bit of a definition, it's the large migration or dispersion of people from their original homeland. So you imagine this like a mass exodus of people, which if we go back all the way back, right here, that last word in that first stanza, unbound by war and exodus, that's what we're referring to, all these people leaving. Okay, alliterative description is used to paint a picture of the mass amount of people fleeing this war zone. So you've got here, disorder of diaspora, so that repetition of that D sound. They're fleeing their home, they're fleeing this war zone. It's not going to be orderly. Imagine that if we were invaded, people aren't going to be lining up in order, waiting to leave. It's going to be complete panic. It's going to be complete chaos. So it adds this tone of it's scary. It's a tone of panic. Fear is riddled throughout this entire stanza. So it's a scary contrast to the previous descriptions of Vietnam we had in the 6th stanza. I'm not going to go back because I know that's probably annoying. But if you think back to that 6th stanza where he's describing his thoughts about his mum being free in Vietnam and these beautiful descriptions of the street markets and the countryside, and then you get this description, it's a very stark contrast between the two. And that's obviously done on purpose. And our last stanza is the homeland was a mist. The cerulean depths of sea stirred on the horizon like some agitated womb. Boats wet as one long vow, as the city crumbled and my mother among them fled, with nothing but me growing inside. So the way I interpret this, the word mist may represent the distant memory. I'm picturing them on this boat in the middle of this body of water, and they're looking out at this destructive seen, but it's starting to maybe be covered by this mist from the water, from this maybe some sort of fog. They can no longer see it clearly, and that might represent this foggy memory, possibly, that the mother has of her homeland, because she maybe hasn't been back there for a very long time. So it's almost like a distant memory. It's not completely visible anymore. It's kind of what mist does. It covers things. So we got the city was literally falling apart because it was being invaded. But also represents that the government was being dismantled at the time as well. It was no longer that city that she remembers. It was now a completely new city with a new leader and a new government. So the mother is starting a new life as a refugee, interestingly, but she's also creating life herself, as she's obviously pregnant. That's what we find out at the end there. Her new dream and new role is as a nurturer. So we talked about before that she had this role and then she had this dream to be a teacher. Her new dream now is to be a mother. So, and we've got this motherly imagery being created as well through the term womb. Agitated is obviously referring to the idea of the womb being upset. If you agitate something, it's upset or, wound up. And we've got that simile coming through for the ocean as well. So the ocean isn't calm. This whole stanza is reflective of, this isn't a calm time. This is a time of turmoil, but from this turmoil, new life is created. Not only just the new life is in the baby being created, but this new life for this mother as well, as she's obviously going to become a refugee of Australia. Okay, so that brings us up to the end of the poem. I know it was a very, very long poem. Hopefully doing it this way as well was a little bit quicker. But we have 3 poems to go. There are 6 in total. So as I said, please make sure that you have this poem well annotated and have your notes ready as well, so we can jump right into the discussion in class when I see you guys next. Okie dokes. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.